institution for that particular program. It's been a program that has allowed us to bring some of the really true leaders in America to Southeastern. It's been an opportunity for us to sit and visit with and get to chat with folks like we're going to today that have set policy. They've been involved directly in the opportunities that you all are being able to experience as students. It's amazing to me every time you bring someone like this in. It's just amazing to sit and listen to the stories, and we've had so many top quality people in here with this program. And certainly today is not only no example, but I think you'll find one of the more delightful young men with us here today that you will have had a chance to visit with. What the game plan will be that Congressman Ford will make some comments, and he's indicated that he would save a little time at the end. We'll be out by 10:40, but maybe just a hair before that. But he's indicated that he'll save some time at the end for us to have a chance maybe to ask some questions and get some answers. So you might want to be thinking about that. And I do want to tell you that this is a guy who has written all the rules, written all the conditions of education for nearly the last 30 years. And with that, I want to do a formal introduction of our guest today. And it is indeed a great pleasure that I can introduce to you this morning, Congressman William D. Ford, or maybe we should say the Honorable William D. Ford, because Mr. Chairman Ford did not run for re-election, so he actually left the Congress in December this past year. He has served on the House Committee on Education and Labor basically from 1965 till January 1, 1995, in December. And he has helped to write virtually every piece of legislation, federal legislation, since the 89th Congress. During his tenure on the committees, he's helped pass familiar legislation, including the Head Start Program, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Higher Education Act, the Reauthorization Act. As we sat and visited last night, I was just absolutely amazed as I was coming up through the ranks and remembering some of the kinds of things that we have dealt with over the past 25 or 30 years. And Congressman Ford was very much instrumental in all of those programs. He chaired Education and Labor. He initiated a number of major education reforms. In the 103rd Congress alone, he guided the passage of the National Community Service Trust Act, Goals 2000, the Educate America Act, School to Work Opportunities Act, and the Head Start Act. He's also very instrumental in guiding President Clinton's most recent education initiative, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act through the House. His role as chairman of the subcommittee on post-secondary education, he's helped to create and sustain federal programs supporting higher education, including, most importantly, the student financial aid programs that will make available to students this year more than $27 billion in grants, loans, and work opportunities. As a result of his dedication and service to higher education, he's received honorary doctorates from a list of institutions that absolutely would blow your mind. I'm just going to run through a few of them. Eastern Michigan, Westfield State College, Grand Valley State College, Wayne State University, Northern Michigan, Michigan State University, Central Michigan University, University of Troy, University of Michigan, Cleary, Long Island University, Northeastern University, Columbia College, and on and on. Madonna College, St. Edwards, Peru State, University of Denver, and Western Michigan University. Honorary doctorates, that's just a partial list of the place where he's been honored. He was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1927, graduated from Melvindale High School in Melvindale, Michigan, before attending Wayne State University and Nebraska State Teachers College. He started off with the idea of being an elementary school teacher, wound up somehow going to law school and become one of the most prominent people in the educational field in recent history, in this decade probably. And it is an absolute delight. And by the way, he has some Oklahoma experiences. Many years ago, as a young 17-year-old seaman, was assigned to gunnery school in Purcell. And so that was his first experience with Oklahoma. He is a marvelous storyteller, a delightful gentleman, someone that you just love to sit and visit with, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you this morning the Honorable William D. Ford.
Thank you, Larry. You were running so well, I could have sat there all morning. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I talked to my wife, who spent part of her young life with, she was a military brat, and her father is a retired Air Force general, and she spent a few years at a place called Tinker Field. And she's a lawyer in Washington. She's represented people from Oklahoma over the years. And as a matter of fact, I was introduced to her by the guest of honor this evening, Chancellor E.T Dunlap, when he came to see me the very first time I met him. And she was introduced as his lawyer. A lot of other things happened in the interim, but now I expect to spend the rest of my life with E.T Dunlap's lawyer. There are not very many people I could say that about. I had to go back and do something I haven't had to do as a committee chairman for a long time. I had to prepare my own speech for tonight, so I didn't bring that over. I don't want to make a speech at you. I have to make one tonight, and that ought to be plenty. But I was forced to, preparing to it, to go back and talk to people that I haven't talked to for a little bit, and go back to sources to be brought up to date on what is happening. I'm practicing law in Washington. I'm teaching at the University of Michigan, and I'm sitting on with several former governors and former members of Congress a committee for the 20th Century Foundation in New York City, where we sit and try to think of how we're going to place people who are being displaced in this very rapidly changing economy of the country. If you don't have a college degree, you can expect that you're going to have a minimum of 5 different occupations in your working years. If you do have a college degree and you're lucky, you're going to have almost the same number. The difference is that instead of going up and down like a seesaw, as the high school graduate has to do, you'll stay up here and move from one activity to another and really stay sort of above sea level all the time. As Larry said, I came to Oklahoma the first time as a very green 17-year-old new enlistee in a program that the Navy was running during World War II called the Combat Aircrew Program. And I wanted, in the worst way, to fly around in airplanes and kill Japanese. Because by the time I got into the service, things were pretty much under control in Europe. And it was pretty clear that we were being trained not to go over there and fight with the Germans, but to go toward the Pacific. They sent me to Norman, Oklahoma, where I had my first experience on a college campus. There's a little college up there in Norman that you've probably heard of. And my first experience with college stuffed shirts. I met a nice young lady in town and asked her to have dinner with me. I thought I was being very sophisticated in doing that. And she said, well, we're not allowed to do anything off the campus with anybody unless we have permission of our substitute mother here at the sorority, who was the mother at the sorority house. So I went to meet her. She wasted no time telling me that she had no intention of allowing her nice young ladies from Oklahoma to be contaminated by dirty old Yankee sailors. Now, I was 17, and I asked her how many people she had in her sorority who were my age. She said, what difference does that make? I said, well, you know, I look at somebody who's 18, 19, 20 years old as pretty mature. At 17, you do. And you're telling me that I'm too old and crusty to be a decent person and associate with them, there's something wrong. I came to be a friend of that lady, and she was one of the people who encouraged me by pointing out that being in a college, like that college, could be a very pleasant experience. Uncle Sam gave me an opportunity after he finished teaching me to shoot people at Purcell, which is south of Norman. And we had, I don't know what's up there now, but we had miles and miles and nothing but miles and miles, and we shot it all up with 50 caliber machine guns. And then they gave me an examination and decided that they were going to turn me into an officer and a gentleman. So they said, you got to go to college. Now at that time there were V5 programs in every major college and university in the country. And I had all kinds of ideas about where I would end up, maybe even the University of Michigan back home. And they sent me to a little school much smaller than this school in Nebraska. That was the Nebraska State Teachers College at Peru. And in no time at all I discovered that I had been right. The only college-trained people I knew when I was a little boy were my teachers. I'd never met a lawyer. I'd seen a doctor, but I didn't associate doctors with being educated. I've gone through a stage as a lawyer where I quit associating them with being educated for a long period of time. But I'm back to their side now because I'm lecturing at the medical school at the University of Michigan, and I have to behave. I discovered some of the most ideological, committed servants of people at that college, and I fell in love with the idea. I was there for a different reason, getting a pre-engineering course before going to flight training. But I was going to school with people who were teachers. It was very tough duty in the Navy, by the way. I don't want to hesitate to tell you how tough World War II was for many of us. There were about 900 students on that campus. 100 of the students were from the United States Navy, young warriors like me. The rest were all girls who were either going through school the first time or back to get additional credits. And there were about 14 or 15 civilian males on the campus. I've never had odds like that in my life before or since, and it was a great learning experience. But I really fell in love with the idea that even I could be a teacher if I worked really hard at it. And I started out to do it. As a matter of fact, I went back to that school after the war was over and used my GI Bill at the beginning, thinking that I wanted to be a teacher. And teachers there talked me into the idea that because I had the GI Bill available, I would consider maybe something like the law. And having never met a lawyer, I didn't know whether that was a good job or a bad job, but I knew it made more money than teaching. And after the war, that seemed important to me. The point is that I was infected by that experience on that campus, like this campus, with something that's never left me. And while I didn't go directly into education as a classroom teacher, I have been fortunate to have some sort of a position for the last 40 years that affected education, either as an attorney for a local school board. I've been an attorney for teachers' unions. I have negotiated teachers' contracts from the school board side, and I've negotiated from the union side, and we always did well, no matter which side I was on. And back in the days when I did it, nobody minded the fact that you represented the union in one town and the school board in the other town. People were a lot more tolerant of each other then than they are now. If somebody tried to do it the way I did it, today I'm afraid that they would read in the newspaper about conflicts of interest and all kinds of hideous sounding things like that. I took a look at, as I have been doing for many years, you'd be surprised how much you can find out about a place like this from Washington if you ask the right people. And I asked the National Association of Student Aid Officers to give me a profile of how the students at this college paid for college. And I told somebody last night, I've been at this long enough, so if I look at a sheet like this, about any college, any place in the United States, I can tell you a little bit about the kind of people who are depending on that college for their opportunity for education. The first thing that jumped off the page and hit me was that, and I only have the figures for 93, 94 school year, not 94, 95. There were, at that time, 4,200 students, mostly undergraduate, on this campus. The really almost astonishing thing was that 1,937 of them, almost half, were receiving a Pell Grant. Now, Pell Grant dates back to the time when we started the Pell Grant with President Johnson. It was a program for low-income children who normally never went to college in this country. And it was designed to try to encourage people from low family income backgrounds into college. The other programs came along later. The Pell was right at the beginning, and it's a part that we called it the Basic Education Opportunity Grant in Washington terms originally, and then it was later named for Senator Pell of Rhode Island. Lyndon Johnson was an absolute fanatic about the idea that everybody ought to have an opportunity to get an education commensurate with their ability. And it's kind of interesting now if we go back and read what Lyndon Johnson was telling us 30 years ago when he wrote the Higher Education Act. If I talk that way now, half the audience would get up and walk out because he never said anything about a sheet. He always talked about every young man in this country ought to have the opportunity to get as much education as he was capable of absorbing. Now, he wasn't a sexist because he proved that over and over again with the other things that he did, but it was the way people thought just 30 years ago about college students. For the last decade, that has completely turned around. We now have more women participating in higher education as students than we have men. We also have more people over the age of 22 than under the age of 22, which back then we referred to somebody over 22 as, unless they were in a doctoral program, as a non-traditional student. And what we called the non-traditional student is now the traditional student. The average age of a student in community colleges across this country is someplace in the middle 30s. And I've attended commencement exercises out across the country and seen people in their 70s getting their piece of paper for the first time in their life. And you know, it's kind of funny when you're at a big Eastern university and a woman comes across the stage with her robe on, and teenagers in the front row stand up and say, "Attaway, Grandma, go get him." What's happened in this country in the years of the man that we're going to be honoring tonight has been a real revolution in the country's support for its people getting an opportunity for education. I'm worried about whether we're going soft on that, and we'll know next few months when we see what the politicians, you see, I'm a taxpayer now, so I can talk about those politicians a day. After 30 years as part, I was always part of day. I'm not part of day now. I paid taxes when I was a member of Congress, but nobody I represented believed that. Somehow they believed that I had very high lifestyle, chauffeured limousine, everything else, and a tax-free income from the government. I didn't have any of those things. But I had the greatest opportunity that anybody in my family was ever given for a lifetime and a career in growing through my jobs with the educational gains that we made in this country. I observed to somebody last night that when we went into World War II, we woke up and very rudely were reminded that we had the least educated population in terms of higher education to fight the war of all of us who were involved in World War II, allies or enemies. They all had more college-trained people than we did. At the time of World War II, there were about, the Census Bureau tells me, there were about one four-year degree for every 20 people in the United States that were over the age of 25 years old. Starting with the war, we took people like me and others and sent them to college because they didn't have college before they got into the service. And we found that we had to use the public money to train everything from doctors to engineers. Not many people realize that we trained literally thousands of doctors by paying their full way through a crash course in medicine at our major medical schools in the country because we didn't have enough young doctors to draft for a full-scale war. And we tried to run and catch up and do all of these things. And my generation learned something from that experience about how valuable an educated population is to this country. Now, in 1993, the Census Bureau tells me, we had reached the point where 1 in 5 of all the Americans over the age of 25 have a four-year degree as a minimum. 1 in 5 from 1 in 20. That's a lot of progress. That gives us a much healthier mix of college-trained people in our overall population. And there is no way in the world that we can talk any sense about the future, whether we're talking about military strength or economic strength, if we don't keep investing in the young people to get the kind of technically trained people we need. And it starts with the young people who are on this campus. How many of you still believe you want to be a classroom teacher? Well, I think that's wonderful because I've got to tell you that truly is God's work on earth. The person who has the ability to motivate a child and teach them, and not everybody that goes into a classroom has, of course, but if you've got the drive to do it, you'll figure it out sooner or later. That's where it all starts. That's really where it all starts. Unless you're lucky enough to be born with intelligent parents who start training you before you go to school. The thing that I try to talk to young people about these days that seems to make the most impression on them is how much do we make? It's very interesting. When I first went to Congress, the College Board, which every year interviews college freshmen all over the country with a series of questions, and then they would report to us and everybody else what people who were starting college were thinking. Back in the 60s, 75% of the people entering college would answer the question, why are you going to college, with, I want to make a safe world, I want to make a healthier world, I want to save the environment, I want to make life better for people. Altruistic objectives. I'm sorry to tell you that during the last decade that has changed. And I've watched sadly each fall as the figures come in from the College Board indicating that now about 75% of the freshmen answer that same question this way: to make more money. That's what college freshmen of today tell people they have in mind. Well, if that's true, I'd like to remind you who've already made the first step and are here, that you better hang on and do well here, because we've got people that do a very good job of tracking the lifetime earnings of people by education. The current figures indicate to us that the difference between a high school graduate and a four-year college graduate, and there are all kinds of exceptions to this, but this is the total of the population of the country, is almost 100% in lifetime earnings. In other words, you can make twice as much money during your lifetime with a four-year degree, if you're just average, than the just average high school graduate is going to make in their lifetime. If you get a master's degree with that, you'll add another $1.5 million to that during your working lifetime. And if you get a professional degree, you can add another $3 million plus to it during your working lifetime. Now, those don't sound like big figures against what you can get for playing professional basketball or baseball, but in the real world of work out there, recognizing that without any effort on your part, the jobs that you think are going to be there may be obsolete or non-existent by the time it's your turn. I represented, during most all of my political career, automobile workers in the suburbs of Detroit. When I first went to Congress, there was hardly a home in my congressional district that didn't have somebody with a paycheck coming from the automobile industry. Now, as the saying goes, you can shoot a cannon down any street without hitting an auto worker. And all three of the automobile companies made more money last year than they ever made in any year in their history. But they did so with 40% of the people employed that were employed by those companies 10 years ago. So what I'm telling you is that one of the highest paid industrial jobs in this country for many, many years is now only 40% of its size. And, shocking even more, if you were thinking of a great future in industry, our auto worker, who is reputed during my lifetime as being the highest paid blue-collar worker in the country, is now 5th in the world. The Germans make more money, the British make more money, the Frenchman makes more money, and the Japanese makes more money working in their automobile plants than our people do. It's a real blow when you sit down and look at these numbers to understand where we've come to, and that we are not coming towards something that we can solve with an atom bomb. We can only stay competitive with all these other societies if we try to keep up with them in educating our people. This type of school and the state institutions like it all across the country are the real breadbasket of the educated population of the future. A college doesn't have to be turning out Einsteins or Dr. Salks to be a great college. It's got to turn out solid people who can think, who have been given enough education to be able to reason, and then we could see some sense come to government in this country. I hope that by the time those of you who are students finish college, you will be so thoroughly disgusted by the American political process of name-calling and negative advertising and the way it's been going in recent years, that you'll rebel against that and lead, as a leader of the American people, back to the good old days. Can you imagine Lincoln and Douglas debating today anything, any place in the state of Illinois? I don't know if there'd be enough police to protect them from the mobs. The days of civil discourse in our public life slipped away from us. And it was part of the reason that I finally came to the conclusion that 30 years was enough in Congress. When I sat down with people and they told me the only way I was going to get reelected again was to have my opponent, whoever came out of the woodwork to run against me, checked up on, find a skeleton in his closet, and then spend a lot of money with television to blacken that person in the people's minds, and then I'd be safe for another term. I ran 15 times for the Congress successfully. I was on the ballot 30 times, counting primaries and generals, and always was lucky enough to win, and can't tell you the name of 3 people who ran against me in all those years, because I never had anything to say about them. It was expected that I went out and talked to people about what I believed to be right and what I would be doing, and let the person on the other side, or persons on the other side, explain themselves. Not today. Everybody is defined by their opponent. And you'll see it start in the Republican primaries very early next year, because they've got a big field. And the only way that some of those lesser-known candidates are going to start to emerge from the pack, or hope to emerge from the pack, is to tear down the people who seem to be leading. And in that process, as a Democrat, I'm not unhappy to see them tear each other up, because I'm hoping that we can re-elect Bill Clinton. I campaigned with him in '92. My committee staff and I helped to write his education platform, and he has passed everything he promised to do in education when he was a candidate. And next to Lyndon Johnson, there has never been a president in modern time in Washington who cared as much about education as Bill Clinton does. So I have a natural prejudice in favor of him. I also had a lot of people from Arkansas who came to my auto plants and worked, so I've always been able to understand Clinton. Even since he's been in Washington, he's lost a little bit of his accent, but when he was campaigning in Michigan, he sure was from down south. There'll be attacks on him when the time comes, and there have been nothing but attacks since he started. But I hope that the educated leadership of this country is going to regurgitate the politicians who have been practicing politics the way it's been going for at least the last decade, and insist on a return to the good old days. If Carl Albert was still running for the House, somebody would be running negative ads against him. And I knew Carl for many years in the Congress. I carried his proxy on the Education and Labor Committee for almost a year with a promise and blood oath to him that I would always protect impact aid, which was very important to Oklahoma. I can't imagine somebody like him, who came out of a very small high school in a country town in Oklahoma and went out of the country the first time as a Rhodes Scholar. Maybe I could share with you something about Carl that a lot of people haven't heard. The year that he moved up from majority leader to speaker, Morris Udall from Arizona and I were leading some classes of newly elected, between the election and January when the Congress came into session, newly elected members to tell them what pencil sharpeners in the bathrooms were, and sort of an indoctrination. And a newly elected black congressman from Chicago, Illinois, who had been on the Board of Aldermen in Chicago for more than 25 years, was in the room when Carl came in to say hello to the new members. And that black man was Ralph Metcalf, who was on the relay team with a man named Jesse Owens in 1936 when the Americans took all of the track events humiliated Adolf Hitler and double humiliated Adolf Hitler when these black American athletes went up to get the gold medal. Now here's a man that was killing people just for being Jewish or whatever reason he didn't like them. And you can imagine being humbled in Germany at the International Olympics by them. When Ralph Metcalf met the speaker, it wasn't Ralph Metcalf who asked for an autograph, it was the speaker to be. And Carl says, Mr. Metcalf, I'm so happy to have a chance to meet you after all these years. In 1936, that little guy from Oklahoma was on the same ship that was taking our Olympic athletes to Europe for the 36 Olympics with another country boy from down south named Dean Rusk. They were contemporaries as Rhodes Scholars. And he says, on the ship, there were always so many people crowded around you athletes, and especially you and Mr. Owens, that I could never get close to you. Could I have your autograph? Well, the whole place just went up in smoke. Here's a brand new elected congressman being asked for his autograph by a man who's going to be the speaker very shortly. That's the Carl Albert that I know, and that's the Carl Albert that the people in this state kept sending to Washington to represent him for a long time. Now there are people now who say we ought to have some artificial rule that after 12 years you'd have to fire him no matter how well he was doing. He stayed there 30 years and brought to his state the honor of the highest elective position, direct elective position in the country, and I include the presidency when I say that because there's an electoral college that gets involved with the presidency, and you don't have to have a majority of the votes to get elected. People will quickly remind you that Bill Clinton only had 43% of the vote. That's 3% more than Abraham Lincoln had when he was elected. So we don't always have the man who got the most votes or a man who got the majority of the votes. Just a plurality will do it. I think that the kinds of things that the Carl Alberts of this country have done to support public education at all levels are personified in this campus and the kind of people who come here. Those who would balance the budget by shifting more of the cost of education to the students, and I have to tell you, we've been doing that steadily so that we've increased the cost of getting college education to the point where we're really pricing people out of the game. If the federal aid does not continue at the present rate of support, then something has to give. If all federal aid disappeared tomorrow in the name of having some money to balance the budget, there won't be an empty seat in Harvard in September. There won't be an empty seat at Yale in September. There won't be an empty seat at the University of Michigan in September, because people of wealth will be able to send students there. There will be empty seats in schools like this in every state across the country where ordinary people struggle for their opportunity for education. And the difference between the aid that comes here for the student is not the difference between an expensive education and a cheap education. It's a difference between an educational opportunity and no educational opportunity. The rubber meets the road when you get to the former teachers' colleges across this country. Almost all of them now are called universities and have become universities, but only a couple of decades ago we still had normal schools and teachers' colleges. Those are the schools that for many, many years in this country have been providing an opportunity for the ordinary people to get on to the merry-go-round of higher education and succeed. And I really hope that for as long as I have to hang around Washington as a member of a law firm, that I can pick their conscience every time I catch somebody trying to balance the budget by making it tougher for my grandchildren to go to college. I hope you'll watch that very closely, and I hope you'll be heard. You're fortunate in having a congressman here, I was with him last night, who is a supporter of education. And we were kidding about it last night. He picked my pocket as a chairman for $31 million for Oklahoma in Impact 8. And it's only recently that I came to understand it wasn't a one-time $31 million. It's $31 million a year. And he was only in Congress in his second term when he did this to me. And he didn't do it to me in Washington. We were shooting quail together in Southwest Texas. And he started complaining about what the Bush administration was doing with a regulation in the Department of Education that was going to discriminate against the counting of Indian housing and Indian land in Oklahoma for Impact 8 that had always been counted for Impact 8 from the beginning, because that law was written by a man named Oscar Rose from Midwest City and signed by Harry Truman. And from its earliest day, Oklahoma was one of the principal beneficiaries. There was a school superintendent from here that went up and lobbied that into federal law that benefited all the rest of them. And now I think that the city of San Diego, because of the tremendous military concentration there, gets more money from that program than several of the middle American states who used to get the money when we had military bases scattered all over. But the fact is that you have somebody currently that I know to be somebody I can turn to and say, will you help me? They're trying to cut back on our education money. And he's a tight-fisted guy. He's much tighter with a penny than I was, unless he's getting my penny for his people. He doesn't want to spend money. But he does believe in investing in education. And so long as you have him and people like you, we're going to go on, and schools like this will stay in business. And I have to stop now and take a couple of questions if we have time. I can't see you, by the way, so you have to shout at me. I can't see you to stand up.
Mike's on the floor. Anyone has questions?
Here's something.
Hi, I'm Vicki Arnett, and I'm a junior elementary ed major. And my question is, to what extent is the Republican contract with America a mandate against extensive education aid legislation?
The contract itself doesn't directly impact education. The problem is that Newt gets a new idea every time he gets up. And someplace after they took over this spring, he put a real mischievous little boy from Ohio in charge of the budget. Mr. Kasich is a Peck's bad boy. For years during the Reagan administration, we from Michigan had to apologize for a former congressman who became the budget director for Mr. Reagan and went after student aid with a vengeance. When I asked him in front of our committee once, why in the world are you putting so much effort on cutting back on student aid? He said, I've got to find dollars to make the president's budget look good. I said, well, why pick on education? He said, you know, they asked Willie Sutton. The young people may not remember Willie Sutton. He was famous in my generation. He robbed banks over and over, and he seemed to get caught every time he robbed a bank, and he spent most of his life in and out of prisons. And toward the end of his life, he was asked by a reporter, Willie, you've got to be the lousiest bank robber that ever lived. Why do you keep robbing banks? He says, that's where the money is. And that's what the budget director told me. If you want to find money, that's where it is. Now, you can't go after Social Security because the senior citizens will wipe you out. That's political suicide to go after anything for the senior citizens. But you can talk about in-school interest, for example, the average student who uses loans to go through 4 years of college, if you take the average they owe at the end of the 5 years when they're into repayment, we figure that by not paying the in-school interest to the lender, we increase the cost of that education money to the student by 20 or 30%. Now, you're talking about big money, and you're talking about a big anchor to put around somebody's neck when they're starting out in life. It's pretty hard to go out and borrow money to buy a home, to buy a car and other things when you are so far in debt. And this would put all the students further in debt. It would not give 1 penny more profit to the bankers, but it would make the budget look good to the extent that it was done, and it does the whole thing by shifting the burden of that much money from the rest of the taxpayers in the country to the students who are going to school during the life of this budget. I'm hopeful that the Senate is going to defeat that when it gets over there, but that wasn't in the contract for America. That was something that Kasich put together after he became chairman of the Budget Committee. Relatively late blooming idea, and at first, the people in education across the country didn't recognize how serious it was. Now, the associations of colleges and universities, including the Association of State Colleges and Universities, to which this school belongs, I'm sure, have started mounting an education program to tell people what's at stake here. And while the House may run wild with something like that, when it gets to the Senate, there are people over there, including the lady from Kansas who has the job that I had as chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate, who aren't going to stand for that kind of impact on education. It's something you have to watch over the next few months. If it stays quiet and you don't hear anybody talking about it, it might happen. But once it gets out to the people, I looked at some polls within the last 2 weeks that indicate that across the country where people were asked, what things do you think we can cut to balance the budget? Now everybody can guess that the number one thing that people of all ages across the country said you can't cut is Social Security. That's sacred. Number 2 was money for education. Way ahead of defense, way ahead of clean water, way ahead of all the other things that are being cut. And everything's being cut. 80% of the people said they didn't want any cut in funds for education. Now I hope that people out across the country are going to educate the Congress to know that's how the American people feel, and the people out across the country themselves will let their congressmen know that's how they feel. The American people don't have confidence in very much anymore. They doubt all of us, and they doubt all institutions. But they do have confidence in fellow Americans who have to get up and go on the gumption to try to get an education they want to help with. Given an opportunity, they will help every time they get a chance. So I don't think that it's an ideological thing that they brought to Washington. It's when they started playing around with the promise to balance the budget that they discovered here was a place with a lot of money in, and cases got into it. It produces, it would shift about $12 billion from other government programs to students of cost. And that's not insignificant when you're trying to balance a budget that's over $200 billion out of whack. I think we've run out of time.
I think we've run out of time. We want to,
You see how I filibustered that one away?
30 years of Congress, and you can figure out how to do that. Congressman, we appreciate you being with us this morning and yesterday and the rest of the day and tonight. Let's give him a Southeastern welcome.
wrong impression when I talk about the Pell Grants. The Pell Grant is the one program that the student doesn't have to pay anything back. And that's not the biggest program on this campus. In addition to the programs that come here that don't have to be paid back, the students on this campus borrow more than half of all the money that comes to this campus in student aid, and they're going to someday pay it back to our successors. They're paying their own way, even though it looks like federal aid, by signing a piece of paper that obligates them for many years in the future to pay it back. And it's not something for nothing. And nobody gets a free lunch out of this. Even the very poor student who gets a Pell Grant won't pay the full load for anybody to go anyplace to college, because it's figured as a percentage of the cost of attendance. And if you ran away from here to a community college trying to get a cheaper education with a Pell Grant, you'd find you get a cheaper Pell Grant too. But the students who are here are borrowing this year more than $5 million that they will spend the best years of their life paying back for the privilege of being here for an education. They deserve the support of everybody that can help them. Thank you.
I know many of you have to go on to other classes, but we'll ask Congressman Ford to hang around here and visit for a few minutes if anyone wants to come and talk to him, ask questions a little more personally. Thank you all for coming.